Hi, I'm Bob Hill, and I'm the president of the Church of Scientology Mission of Riverdale at 308 Broadview Avenue in Toronto. Happy Valentine's Day. Would you like to know more about love and how to increase love around you? Well, today's sermon is based on the writings of L. Ron Hubbard from the book, the Scientology Handbook, Chapter 3. Now, another word for love is affinity. Okay, so keep that in mind. The first corner of what we call the ARC triangle, affinity, reality, communication, the first corner of the triangle is affinity. The basic definition of affinity is the consideration of distance, whether good or bad. So you got it? So the basic definition of affinity is the consideration of distance, whether good or bad. The most basic function of complete affinity would be the ability to occupy the same space as something else. Now, what would be an example of that? You often see people who have a lot of affinity for each other hugging each other. They try to occupy the same space. You see a child who loves their dog. They pick up the dog and they hold the dog close to them and the dog's licking their face. That's affinity. Now, you see people who don't have much affinity and they stand, well, you can take what COVID has made us have less affinity by making us have to stand 6 feet apart, wear masks, and we can't touch each other. Now, when the disease is over, we'll get away with that, but people actually like affinity. The word affinity is here used to mean love, liking, or any other emotional attitude. Affinity is conceived in Scientology to be something of many facets. Affinity is a variable quality. So that means you can have less affinity and you can have more affinity. Like I said, being made to stay a distance from people lessens affinity. Being able to go up and hug your best friend or your girl or your wife or your husband, that's more affinity. So affinity is here used as a word with the context degree of liking. Men would not be men without affinity. Every animal has affinity to some degree, but man is capable of feeling an especially large amount. Long before he organized into cities, he had organized into tribes and clans. See that? So he organized into tribes and clans and later on cities so he could be closer to people. He wanted to have affinity. Before the tribes and clans, there were undoubtedly pacts. Man's instinctive need for affinity with his fellow human beings has long been recognized, and his domestication of other animals shows that this affinity extends also to other species. So man natively likes affinity. It's a very, very small group, handful of people that don't want you to have affinity. Most, in fact, the great majority of people want to have affinity for each other. One could have guessed that the race which first developed affinity to its highest degree would become the dominant race on any planet, and that has been borne out. So man loves affinity. He wants more affinity. He wants affinity from the plant and animal kingdom, etc. So he's the dominant species. A child is full of affinity. Not only does he have affinity for his father, mother, brothers and sisters, and his playmates, but for his dogs, his cats, and stray dogs that happen to come around. But affinity goes even beyond this. You have a feeling of affinity for objects. I love the way the grain stands out in that wood. You've seen that. You look at a piece of wood, it's got a beautiful grain on it. You have affinity for that piece of wood. There's a feeling of oneness with earth. Blue skies, rain, mill ponds. Mill pond is where you had a mill grinding grain with a body of water around it. Cartwheels and bullfrogs, which is affinity. So you can actually have affinity with all these things. You've probably experienced it. I can recall one time when I was 8 years old, I went outside and it was a bright, beautiful day. And I found my affinity went right out the roof, and I was standing there and I felt everything is just fantastically gorgeous. And you've probably experienced that yourself to a greater or lesser degree at some time in your life. Affinity is never identification. That's becoming one with another in feeling or interest. So it's not identifying, it's not becoming that other thing. Nor does it go quite so far as empathy. That's the power or state of imagining oneself to be in another person and even shares ideas or feelings. You remain very much yourself when you have affinity for something, but you also feel the essence of the thing for which you feel affinity. You remain yourself, and yet you draw closer to the object for which you have affinity. Got it? So you stay yourself, but you draw closer to the object which you have affinity, or the person. So you could have your favorite girl or boyfriend, and you want to get close to them. You remain yourself, you keep your own identity, but you have a desire to be closer to them, and you have a sense of what they're about. It is not a binding quality. There are no strings attached which you have affinity given. So there's no strings attached to affinity. You can just have affinity for something. There doesn't have to be a reason for it. You could just have affinity. There's no strings attached to it. It doesn't have to be altered or changed. It's your affinity for whatever you have affinity with. To the receiver, it carries no duties and no responsibilities. It is pure, easy, and natural, and flows out from the individual as easily as sunlight flows from the sun. So that's how easy it is for you to have affinity. Affinity begets affinity. If you have affinity for others and you have affinity for your environment, you'll find out there's a lot of affinity towards you. Now on the reverse side of the coin, you have a person who has very little affinity, and they're constantly critical of others. There's a sense of hatred around them, and eventually the affinity for others drops to such a degree. There's no affinity here, there's no affinity there. The person has no one left to not have affinity with, and so they then start to really dislike themselves and have no affinity for themselves. But the person who has a lot of affinity for those around him, he gets a lot of affinity from others, he has affinity for himself, and he finds that he expands. It's an interesting thing. So affinity begets affinity. A person who is filled with the quality will automatically find people anywhere near him also beginning to be filled with affinity. It is a calming, warming, heartening influence on all who are capable of receiving and giving it. Naturally, beings would love to have more of that than more of the other stuff. One can readily observe the level of affinity between individuals or groups. You can see it. You can take a team, and it could be made up of, let's say, 15 superstars, but none of them have affinity for each other, or their affinity for the group is low. And so that team, even though it has all the top superstars, they never win. But you have another team who, the guys are pretty good, but they're not all superstars, but they all have affinity for each other, and they have affinity for the group, and somehow they seem to win. You see it in sports all the time. These underdog teams that they have this incredible affinity for each other, and they win. They just play better. They work well together. They're not all superstars, but they have affinity, and that carries through. And then the underdogs, people will turn around and start liking the underdog and want them to win. It's amazing. So, for instance, two men talking with each other either are in affinity with each other or they aren't. If they are not, they will argue. If they are in affinity with each other, two other things have to be there. They have to have agreed upon a reality, and they have to be able to communicate that reality to each other. Okay? So, they've agreed on a reality, so they have the affinity there, and they are able to communicate that reality to each other. And you'll probably find the affinity will go up much higher. So that's it for today's sermon. Use that on this Valentine's Day. And I'll tell you what, let's make every day Valentine's Day. And let's drive that affinity forward. Thanks. Now with that, I'm going to read to you the creed of the Church of Scientology. We of the Church believe that all men of whatever race, color, or creed were created with equal rights. That all men have inalienable rights to their own religious practices and their performance. That all men have inalienable rights to their own lives. That all men have inalienable rights to their sanity. That all men have inalienable rights to their own defense. That all men have inalienable rights to conceive, choose, assist, or support their own organizations, churches, and governments. That all men have inalienable rights to think freely, to talk freely, to write freely their own opinions, and to counter or utter or write upon the opinions of others. That all men have inalienable rights to the creation of their own kind. That the souls of men have the rights of men. That the study of the mind and the healing of mentally caused ills should not be alienated from religion or condoned in non-religious fields, and that no agency less than God has the power to suspend or set aside these rights overtly or covertly. And we of the Church believe that man is basically good, that he is seeking to survive, that his survival depends upon himself and upon his fellows and his attainment of brotherhood with the universe. And we of the Church believe that the laws of God forbid man to destroy his own kind, to destroy the sanity of another, to destroy or enslave another's soul, to destroy or reduce the survival of one's companions or one's group. And we of the Church believe that the spirit can be saved, and that the spirit alone may save or heal the body. Thanks. Now spread the calming, warm, heartening influence of love all around you and make the world a better place. Learn more about life by reading the Scientology Handbook. Help yourself and others. Join us next Sunday for more ways to improve life. Thank you.